Emma had just turned 7. Until that moment, her life was filled with laughter, games, and the security of her mother's love, Claire. But that day, everything changed. The sun seemed paler, the air heavier. Emma felt it even before hearing the words that would change her life forever. James, her father, was sitting at the kitchen table. His eyes were red, marked by a sadness he couldn't hide. He was holding Emma's hand tightly, as if he needed that contact to stay strong. "Emma, sweetheart, I need to tell you something very difficult," he began, his voice trembling. Emma looked at him, curious and a little worried. She knew something was wrong. "What is it, Daddy?" she asked in her sweet, innocent voice. James took a deep breath, gathering the strength to go on. "Mommy, she went to heaven, Emma. She's not coming back." The words slipped out as if each one weighed a ton. For a moment, Emma remained silent, trying to understand what that meant. But the silence didn't last. "What do you mean, Daddy? Why did she go? When is she coming back?" The questions came quickly, one after another, filled with despair. James tried to answer, but there was no sufficient explanation for a 7-year-old. He just shook his head, unable to hold back his tears. Emma then began crying too. She didn't fully understand what it meant to lose someone forever, but she felt the pain in her father's heart and the absence of her mother like an impossible void to ignore. The following days were a blur for both of them. The house, once full of life and laughter, now seemed like a sad, colorless place. Emma's questions went on. "Why did Mommy have to go? Is she happy in heaven? Does she miss me?" And James, even trying to be strong, did not have all the answers. He was lost himself. Claire's death made no sense. She was young, healthy, full of life. Everyone around the family was shocked, asking the same thing. How did this happen? James, who deeply loved his wife, could not accept that she was simply gone. He relived every moment they had together, trying to find something that would explain the tragedy. But all he had were questions without answers. And so little Emma and her father, James, found themselves facing a pain that felt larger than they could bear. Emma, with the innocence of a child, sought explanations for something even adults could not understand. And James, with the pain of a husband and a father, tried to find the strength to carry on even when the world seemed to crumble around him. Both were united by a bond of love and loss, learning, day by day, how to live with Claire's absence. The day of the funeral came sooner than James would have liked. He still didn't know how to deal with the idea of saying goodbye to Claire forever. However, there was something unusual in all of it that left him uneasy. From the beginning, the medical examiner had been very clear. The casket was to remain closed. "It's better this way," he told James, with a glance that avoided direct eye contact. He offered no further explanation, and James, immersed in his grief, asked no questions. Friends and relatives gathered to pay their last respects. Emma, her confused little eyes observing everything, remained silent. She seemed more attentive to what was going on around her than to what was happening in front of her. Even with so many people offering kind words, she stayed reserved as though trapped in her own thoughts. When the time came to say goodbye, James walked up to the casket, leaving little Emma holding an aunt's hand. He touched the smooth, closed lid and whispered a farewell, feeling a stab in his chest that almost brought him to his knees. Behind him, some people whispered, bothered by the fact that they couldn't see Claire one last time, but James had no strength to explain. He himself didn't understand why things had to be that way. That was when Emma suddenly stood up. Her soft voice cut through the silence of the ceremony. "Mummy's not here." Everyone turned to look at her, surprised. James paused, unsure what to say. "She's not in there," Emma went on, pointing to the casket. "I know she's alive. I saw her." Murmurs grew among the guests. James tried to approach his daughter to calm her, but Emma backed away. "You don't understand. I saw her yesterday looking at me through the window. Why doesn't anyone believe me?" Her voice now carried a note of desperation. All eyes turned to James, expecting him to explain his daughter's behavior. But he didn't know what to do either. He knelt in front of Emma, trying to find the right words. "Emma, sweetheart, sometimes our minds play tricks on us. We're sad, and that can make us see things that aren't there." Emma shook her head firmly. "I'm not making it up, Daddy. She was there. I know it was her." The atmosphere in the room grew even more tense. Some people began to leave, whispering about how the tragedy was affecting the little girl. Others looked at James with pity, as if saying he needed help to cope with the situation, but no one knew that deep down. James also felt something was off. The medical examiner's behavior, the closed casket, and now Emma's words. It all seemed like one big jigsaw puzzle he couldn't piece together. Later that night, while James tried to calm Emma and put her to bed, He found himself thinking about his daughter's words. What if somehow she was right? What if Claire really wasn't in that casket? He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. After all, Claire was dead, right? But a seed of doubt had been planted, and James knew it wouldn't leave him alone anytime soon. The morning after the funeral, James tried to move on, even with his mind full of doubts. He was sitting at the kitchen table, attempting to get Emma to eat something. But the girl seemed restless, pushing her food around with a fork, not really eating. Suddenly, Emma raised her eyes to her father. "Daddy, I saw Mommy again yesterday." The words came out so simply, yet filled with a certainty that made James stop what he was doing. He stared at her for a few seconds, trying to figure out if it was a product of a child's imagination or something more. "Emma, where did you see her?" he asked, trying to stay calm. "Outside, at the edge of the woods. She was hiding behind a tree, but I know it was her. She looked at me, Daddy, and she was wearing a cap and dark clothes, like she didn't want anyone to see her." Emma spoke with so much conviction that James felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't want to believe it, but his daughter's words stirred something inside him. Could Claire really be alive? Or was this just Emma's imagination coping with loss? He needed answers, and fast. That same afternoon, Michael, his old friend and a police officer, came by for a visit. Michael was the observant type, always alert to details. He had been at the funeral and noticed something seemed off, but didn't want to push James at that moment. Now, with Emma's story, he knew he had to intervene. "James, I want to help," Michael said as the two of them drank coffee in the living room. "But you need to be honest with me. Is there something about Claire's death that you're not telling me?" James shook his head, running a weary hand over his face. "I don't know, Michael. All this, the closed casket, Emma's words, none of it makes sense. But at the same time, how could Claire be alive? I saw the death certificate. They told me it was a heart attack." Michael paused, analyzing James's every word. "Look, kids can have wild imaginations, but Emma seems very certain. If she's seeing someone she believes is Claire, I think it's worth investigating. Tell me exactly what she said." James explained everything. The mysterious sightings, the dark clothing, the fact that Emma had seen her mother near the woods. Michael listened carefully, then stood up. "I'll go check it out. It can't hurt, right?" That night, Michael went to the edge of the forest near James's house. He stayed hidden in his car, watching the path Emma had mentioned. The night was almost silent, broken only by the occasional sound of branches snapping in the distance. For hours nothing happened, but suddenly he saw a figure moving among the trees. Michael held his breath and looked more closely. It was a woman. She wore a cap and a dark sports jacket, exactly as Emma had described. The officer felt his heart race. Even from a distance, he was certain it was Claire. He got out of the car carefully, trying not to make any noise, and followed the woman. She seemed to be in a hurry, glancing around as though afraid of being seen. Michael followed her to an old cabin, hidden deep in the woods. When she went inside, he stopped, unsure what to do. There was no doubt. That was Claire, or someone who looked exactly like her. Michael stepped back, took out his phone, and called James. "I think we've found Claire," he said quietly. "But James, brace yourself. Something very strange is happening here, and I don't know if we're ready for the truth." At that moment, both James and Michael knew their lives were about to change. The mystery surrounding Claire's death was only beginning to unravel, and the answers they sought might be more complicated and painful than they imagined. Michael knew he was facing something far bigger than he had anticipated. After seeing the woman who looked like Claire enter the cabin, he decided he couldn't act alone. The next day, he went to the city hospital to investigate who had handled Claire's case. His plan was simple: find the medical examiner who had signed the death certificate and get answers. When he arrived, he went straight to the records department. "I'm looking for Dr. Anderson, the medical examiner who handled Claire Johnson's case," Michael said, showing his police ID. The receptionist looked at him with a puzzled expression. "Dr. Anderson? He retired years ago. We don't have anyone by that name working here." Michael felt the floor drop out from under him. "What do you mean?" "My friend James said it was Dr. Anderson who spoke with him and insisted the casket remain closed." The woman shook her head. "There must be some mistake. Claire Johnson's case was registered here, but not by Dr. Anderson. I can check who signed the documents if you'd like." She left for a few minutes and returned with a file in her hands. Michael read the documents and noticed something even stranger. The signature on the death report was illegible, almost as if someone had tried to hide their identity. The officer thanked her and left, his mind spinning with questions. Who was the man posing as the medical examiner, and why did he insist so strongly that the casket remain closed? Michael's next stop was the cemetery. He needed to confirm a suspicion that had been bothering him since the funeral. After explaining the situation to the cemetery administrator, Michael obtained permission to open Claire's casket. When the lid was removed, what he saw confirmed his suspicions. The casket was empty. He stood there staring at the empty space, trying to process what it meant. Claire wasn't dead. But where was she then? And more importantly, why? Back in his car, Michael went over everything he knew. Emma said she had seen her mother. The casket was empty. The medical examiner was a fraud. Every piece pointed to a meticulous, desperate plan. He drove back to where he had seen Claire the night before, determined to find the truth. Michael discreetly made his way through the forest to the cabin. This time he was prepared. He watched for a while until he was sure Claire was there, accompanied by another person, a young, muscular man with tattoos on his arms. He seemed anxious, gesturing as he spoke to Claire. Michael managed to hear snippets of the conversation through the slightly open window. "We can't stay here any longer, Claire. It's too risky. They're going to find out," the man said. "I know, but I had to see them. I had to see Emma. I couldn't just disappear without saying goodbye," Claire replied, her voice choked. "That was a mistake. Now they're going to find us. And you know what that means," he shot back, visibly upset. Michael backed away, trying to process what he had just heard. Claire had faked her own death, but why? And who was this man? He knew he had to act quickly before they disappeared again. Taking out his phone, he called the station, requesting backup. When the officers arrived, they surrounded the cabin and arrested both of them without resistance. Claire said nothing as she was taken away, but her eyes were filled with tears. Michael, still trying to put the pieces together, knew the next step would be to interrogate Claire to discover the truth. The next day, during the interrogation, the truth finally came out. Claire revealed that her real name was Elizabeth Carter, and that for years she had been running from a dark past. The man who was with her was her brother, an accomplice in various crimes. When her past threatened to catch up with her, Claire saw faking her death as the only way to protect James and Emma. Michael listened to every word, feeling a mixture of anger, compassion, and disbelief. Claire wasn't the woman James thought she was, but at the same time her actions were motivated by love for her family. Now it was up to Michael and James to decide what to do with this new reality. Their lives would never be the same, but somehow the truth brought an end to the mystery that had been haunting them. In the small interrogation room at the station, the atmosphere felt heavy with the weight of the truths about to emerge. Claire, or Elizabeth, as she finally revealed her real name, sat with trembling hands on the table. Across from her, Michael observed her every gesture and expression, while James stood in the corner, struggling to keep calm. "My real name is Elizabeth Carter," she began, speaking softly, almost in a whisper. "Before I met James, I led a complicated life. I did things I'm not proud of. They were choices I made to survive, but they put me on a path of no return." James's eyes widened, unable to believe what he was hearing. The woman with whom he had shared his life for so many years, the mother of his daughter, was a fugitive. "What do you mean by things? What kind of choices?" he asked, his voice filled with pain. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment, but she knew there was no point hiding anymore. "I was part of an international fraud network, identity theft, money laundering. At first I thought it was something harmless, but soon I realized I was in something much bigger. When I tried to get out, they threatened me. They said I would never have peace." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "That's when I met you, James. You were a light in the middle of all that darkness. I wanted to leave everything behind. I wanted to be a better person. When I found out I was pregnant with Emma, I knew I couldn't continue that life. So I disappeared. I cut all ties with that world and created a new identity." Michael folded his arms, trying to take it all in. "So why did you fake your death now? Why not just tell James the truth?" Elizabeth lowered her head, tears streaming down her face. "Because they found me. After all these years, they found me. I got threats against me, against James, against Emma. I knew I couldn't stay. If I just disappeared, they would come after you. But if I died, they would believe it was over." James took a step forward, fists clenched. "You could have trusted me. I would have done anything to protect you and Emma." Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes filled with regret. "I know, but I didn't want to put you in more danger. I thought disappearing was the only way to keep you safe." Michael broke in, trying to remain objective. "And the man who was with you, who is he?" "My brother, David," she replied. He helped me plan everything. He was also on the run, just like me. We figured that together we had a better chance of escaping." Silence fell over the room for a few moments. James ran his hands through his hair, clearly shaken. "So, everything, our life together, was it a lie?" Elizabeth looked at him, tears shining in her eyes. "No, James. My love for you and for Emma was the only real thing in my entire life. It was for you that I tried to change. For you that I did all this. I just wanted to keep you both safe." Michael, sensing the tension in the air, sighed and stood up. "Elizabeth, your actions were driven by love for your family, but that doesn't erase what you did. Interpol is already involved, and now you have to face the consequences of your past." Elizabeth nodded, knowing there was no escape. "I accept that, but please take care of James and Emma. They're not to blame for any of this." In the days that followed, Elizabeth was taken into custody, while James and Emma tried to rebuild their lives. For James, the pain of betrayal was mixed with the love he still felt for her. For Emma, her childhood innocence made her ask, "When is Mommy coming back, Daddy?" James had no idea how to answer. All he could do was hold his daughter and promise she would never be alone. The truth had been revealed, and though it was devastating, it also brought a sense of relief. Now he could move on, even if the shadow of Elizabeth Carter always lingered in his memories. The day of the sentencing was a definitive milestone, a moment everyone knew was coming but no one wanted to face. Elizabeth and her brother David were in court, each on one side of the defendant's table. The charges were serious and they both knew there was no escape. Interpol had gathered indisputable evidence of their crimes, and now all that remained was to await the final verdict. James sat in the back of the room, Emma by his side. He held her hand tightly, trying to give her a sense of security he didn't even feel himself. It was an unbearable weight, watching this woman, whom he had loved and trusted for so many years, be reduced to the figure of a criminal. At the same time, he knew it had to happen. The truth had to come out, and consequences were inevitable. The judge began reading the sentence, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "Elizabeth Carter and David Carter, you have been found guilty of fraud, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. This court hereby sentences you to..." The words that followed seemed to blend into a distant noise for James. He looked at Elizabeth, hoping her expression would reveal how she felt. But she was motionless, eyes fixed on the floor, as if all energy had drained out of her. When the judge finished, officers approached to handcuff them. Elizabeth raised her head, seeking one last chance to look at Emma. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, everything she wanted to say was there, without words. "I love you." Her lips formed silently. Emma, her eyes brimming with tears, clung to James's arm. "Daddy, why is she leaving? Can't she stay?" James felt his heart break, but he knew he had to be strong. He knelt down beside Emma, holding her by the shoulders. "Sweetheart, sometimes people make bad choices, choices that have consequences, but that doesn't mean she doesn't love you. She will always love you, Emma, but now she has to go." Elizabeth was taken away, accompanied by David. As she disappeared through the courtroom door, James knew it would be the last time he would see her. There would be no letters, no visits, no contact. It was a mutual decision. Elizabeth wanted James and Emma to have a chance to start over, free from the constant weight of her dark past. In the days that followed, the house felt empty, as though the air were too heavy to breathe. James tried to fill the silence with small changes. He took down photos of Elizabeth from the walls and carefully stored them away in a box. It wasn't about forgetting her, but protecting Emma, allowing her to revisit those memories only when she was ready. Emma, on her part, faced the situation with the surprising strength of a child who had already seen more than she should. She asked questions, often hard ones, but also began to accept the answers. "Daddy, do you think Mommy's sad where she is?" she asked one night as he tucked her into bed. James hesitated but answered honestly, "I think she is, sweetheart, but I also think, deep down, she's relieved to know we're safe. She loves us very much, Emma, and that will never change." As the weeks went by, James devoted himself to creating a new normal for him and his daughter. He got more involved in her school activities, took her on outings, and made sure she knew she was never alone. Each small moment together was a step toward healing. But at night, when silence took over the house, James found himself lost in thought. He wondered how he hadn't noticed earlier, how he had been deceived for so long. Elizabeth's betrayal hurt, but what weighed on him most was the love he still felt for her, mingled with the sense of loss. She wasn't the woman he believed he knew, yet that didn't erase the moments they'd shared, or the love she showed for Emma. Michael, the police officer friend who helped solve the mystery, stayed in touch, offering support whenever he could. He reminded James that the truth, however harsh, was liberating. Now you can move on without secrets or lies. It's hard, but it's the start of something new, he said during one of his visits, and little by little James began to believe it. He and Emma rebuilt their lives, finding joy in simple things. Laughter returned to the house, timid at first, but growing over time. Emma, in her innocence, showed remarkable resilience. "I know Mommy did something wrong, but she loved me, didn't she, Daddy?" she would ask sometimes, and James always answered, "Yes, she loved you more than anything." Elizabeth's story served as a constant reminder for James. The past always catches up with us, no matter how hard we try to escape. The choices we make have consequences, and facing them is inevitable. But it was also a lesson about the power of love, even when it comes from imperfect places. Elizabeth did what she did because she believed she was protecting her family, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. In the end, the truth brought pain, but it also brought freedom. James and Emma moved forward, bearing the scars of that chapter in their lives, yet also learning to value what they had in the present. Elizabeth's shadow would never fully disappear, but it remained as a reminder that even amid losses, it's possible to find the strength to begin again. This was an emotional story full of twists and turns, teaching us that the past always catches up with us and how important it is to face the truth, however difficult it may be. And now I want to hear from you. What would you do if you were in James's position? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what you think. Oh, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave your like. It really helps get this content out to more people. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories we'll bring you here. See you next time.